What if the only soul who remembered you after years in prison had 4 legs, grey fur, and eyes that still searched for your face? On the outer edge of West Virginia, surrounded by grey skies and rusted fences, stood Black Eagle Penitentiary, a place where time moved slowly and hope came rarely. Inside cell 14, a man lay awake on a hard metal bed, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling as if trying to see beyond it. His name was Jack Callahan, once a quiet carpenter with a gentle heart, now just another forgotten prisoner, labeled and locked away. But Jack's story didn't begin in this cell. It began in a small neighborhood with creaky porches and overgrown backyards where he and his wife Melissa once tried to build a simple life. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and a stray German Shepherd puppy Jack had rescued from the cold one winter evening. He named the pup Shadow because the dog followed him everywhere, never making a sound, just always there. Shadow grew strong, loyal, and clever. He never left Jack's side, not even when everything else did. One rainy night, Jack returned home to hear his wife screaming. Their neighbor, a drunk ex-con with a history of violence, had forced his way into their backyard, shouting threats and swinging a beer bottle. Jack did what any husband would do. He grabbed a broken shovel handle and stepped between the man and his wife. It only took one swing, one moment of panic, of protection, and the neighbor hit the ground. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Jack was arrested that night. He thought the truth would save him, that the court would understand it was self-defense. But the world isn't always fair to men without power, without money, and without fancy lawyers. The jury saw a man who killed another. They didn't see the fear in his wife's eyes or the bruises she tried to hide. Jack was sentenced to 12 years in prison for second-degree murder. Melissa promised to wait. At first, she wrote him letters every week, then once a month, then silence. One day he received a single envelope, no return address. Inside was divorce paperwork, already signed by her. No note, no explanation. Jack folded the papers neatly, set them aside, and never spoke of her again. A year later, he received word that both his parents had passed within months of each other. No one left to mourn with, no one to call. Just a quiet knock from the guard and a "Sorry, Callahan," before the lights went out. All Jack had left was memory and the fading image of Shadow chasing butterflies in the yard, curled up at his feet while he carved wood under the porch light. In prison, Jack never raised his voice, never picked a fight. He worked quietly in the library, organizing books no one read. He helped clean the mess hall. He once pulled a young guard out of harm's way during a riot, a moment that earned him no reward, just fewer eyes watching his every move. But now, Jack's body was giving out. He had been coughing blood for weeks. The prison infirmary took x-rays, then more tests. Then came the visit from the doctor, short, cold, efficient. "Stage 4. You've got maybe a month." They didn't bother offering treatment, not at this prison. Not for a dying inmate with no one on the outside. Jack didn't cry. He simply nodded, walked back to his cell, and lay down in the dark. That night he whispered to the ceiling. "Just once," he said, "let me see Shadow again. Just once, before it ends." He didn't expect an answer, but someone was listening. Captain Daniel Reeve, the warden of Black Eagle, had spent over 20 years behind steel bars and concrete walls. He believed in rules, believed in control, but he also believed in watching, in noticing. And he had noticed Jack. He remembered the riot. He remembered the quiet dignity, the way Jack never asked for anything, until now. So Captain Reeve made a call. One of his contacts at the local animal shelter owed him a favor. The name Shadow was entered into the system. Surprisingly, they found a match. A German Shepherd, around 10 years old. turned in by a woman named Melissa Blake 6 months ago. The notes read, "Owner deceased." Reeve said nothing, but something in his chest turned cold. He signed the papers. In the early morning light, a white van pulled into the back gate of Black Eagle. A volunteer named Clara Thompson stepped out with a leash in hand. Behind her was Shadow, tail low, ears twitching. His muzzle had grown grey, his eyes cloudy with time, but there was strength in his frame, and something sharp still flickered in his gaze. He didn't bark, he didn't pull, he simply walked toward the gate, as if he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. As they approached cell 14, Captain Reeve stood silently nearby. Inside, Jack rose slowly from the bed, pressing one hand against the wall for support. When the door slid open, and man and dog faced each other for the first time in 4 long years, the air in the room seemed to freeze. But what happened next would surprise them all. For most prisoners, the world outside fades like fog in the rearview mirror, slowly, painfully, until it disappears completely. For Jack Callahan, that world vanished all at once. The day he arrived at Black Eagle Penitentiary, the gates slammed shut behind him with a finality that felt louder than the judge's gavel. Concrete walls, fluorescent lights, meals served on plastic trays, the scent of bleach, sweat, and iron. His new reality was cold and exact. Every second was counted, every mistake watched. But the pain that truly lingered wasn't physical. It was what he left behind and how quickly it unraveled. His wife, Melissa, had been by his side during the trial. Her hands clutched his in the courtroom. She wept when the verdict came down. 12 years, second-degree murder. She promised she'd wait, promised to keep the house, promised to keep Shadow, their dog. The last words she whispered through the glass of the prison visitation room were, "No matter what happens, Jack, I'll be here." At first, she kept her word. Letters came every week. She told him about work, about their backyard, about how Shadow missed him, how he still waited by the door every evening, like he expected Jack to come walking through. Jack lived for those letters. He read them over and over, folded them carefully and kept them in a small box under his mattress. They were his last link to the life he'd lost, but then something shifted. The letters came less often. Her tone changed shorter, colder. She didn't mention Shadow anymore. She stopped signing with love. One day, a month passed. Then, 2. Then a guard handed him a thin envelope with no return address. Jack opened it slowly. Inside was a stack of divorce papers, no explanation, no note. "No, I'm sorry." Just her signature, clean and final. He sat on the edge of his bunk for a long time, staring at the pages. He didn't cry. Jack wasn't the kind to fall apart. He simply folded the papers neatly and slid them into the same box where her old letters lived. The next morning, he woke up and went to his library shift like nothing had happened. But something had. Something inside him had dimmed, a quiet light, extinguished. The next blow came less than a year later. 2 guards appeared at his cell door one afternoon, their faces unreadable. One of them handed him a small card, just a scribbled note from the chaplain. Mr. and Mrs. Callahan, deceased, car accident, February 12th. His parents were gone. No funeral. No goodbye. Just a date on a slip of paper and the quiet knowledge that there was no one left out there with his blood, with his memories, with his name. Jack didn't speak for 3 days. Even the guards gave him space. Captain Reeve passed him in the hallway once and offered a small nod, not sympathy, not pity, just acknowledgement. Like 2 soldiers who had survived different wars but understood the wounds all the same. Jack buried his grief like he buried everything else, deep, silent, invisible. But it showed in the way he walked, the way he carried himself. A little slower, a little more tired. What no one knew, what he told no one, was that despite all of it, despite the abandonment, the betrayal, the death, he still held on to one memory. Shadow, that shaggy, bright-eyed puppy he'd found by the dumpster behind the hardware store. The one with a limp in his back leg and a spirit too stubborn to die. Jack had brought him home wrapped in an old towel. Melissa had groaned, but within a week she was calling him baby and feeding him bits of bacon under the table. Shadow was more than a pet. He was Jack's shadow, literally and figuratively. He followed Jack to the porch, to the woodshed, to the grocery store, slept at his feet, waited by the bathroom door. Even on Jack's worst days when work was slow, when the roof leaked, when he and Melissa fought, Shadow was constant. A breathing reminder that loyalty still existed in the world. And now, years later, locked in a cell with no letters, no family, no future, Jack still dreamed of him. Sometimes, in the moments between sleep and waking, he'd see that familiar black and tan face. He'd hear the jingle of a collar, the scratch of paws on old wood floors. Sometimes, he'd even smell the faint scent of wet fur after rain. He didn't know if Shadow was still alive, but he hoped. God, he hoped. That hope kept him warm on the coldest nights. Years passed in a blur. Days bled into each other. Jack built a reputation inside, quiet, steady, dependable. He ran the prison library, helped younger inmates write letters home, translated old books into Braille for blind prisoners. Once, during a sudden hallway fight, he shoved a guard out of the way, taking a punch to the ribs that could have ended someone else's life. He asked for nothing in return. Most inmates faded with time, becoming bitter, angry, violent, or just numb. But Jack, he remained human, even after everything. And that perhaps is why when he whispered, "I just want to see him once," as he lay dying, the universe finally listened. It wasn't about getting out early. It wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about forgiveness. It was about closure, about finishing the story with the only soul who had never betrayed him, the only one who might still remember the man he used to be, the only one who might recognize the stranger he had become. In the quietest hour of the night, when even the hardened sounds of prison life gave way to silence, Jack Callahan lay on his narrow cot and stared at the ceiling, not in fear, not in pain, but in remembrance. He was dying. That much was clear. His body had begun to betray him months ago. The coughs, the weight loss, the sweats. Then came the diagnosis: terminal cancer, stage 4. 1 month, the prison doctor had said, maybe less. But Jack wasn't afraid of dying. He had already lost everything that mattered: his freedom, his family, his name. What more was death but a gentle closing of a chapter that had gone on too long? Still, there was one thing left undone. One tether still bound him to this world. One face that came to him in dreams more vividly than any person ever had: Addo. The German shepherd he'd raised from a broken-legged puppy. The one soul who had never lied, never abandoned, never failed him. Jack didn't want to die as inmate number 6211. He wanted to die as Shadow's person, even if just for a few minutes. So that night, as the wind outside howled through rusted fencing, Jack whispered a request, not to the guards, not to the chaplain, not even to God, but to the room, to the darkness, to whatever force might be listening. If anyone's out there, I just want to see my dog again, that's all. What Jack didn't know was that someone had heard. The next morning, Captain Daniel Reeve, warden of Black Eagle, stood at the far end of the infirmary hallway, sipping bitter coffee from a chipped mug. Reeve had seen his share of death inside these walls: violent deaths, overdoses, suicides, slow deaths like Jack's. He didn't flinch anymore. He didn't ask questions. But something about Jack Callahan had stayed with him over the years. The man never raised his voice. Never asked for favors, never played the system like most others tried to. He read. He worked. He helped. He had dignity, even in chains. So when the infirmary nurse casually mentioned that Callahan had only weeks left and had made a strange request about seeing a dog, Reeve didn't brush it off like he normally would. Instead, he sat down that night, alone in his office, and opened Jack's old intake file. And there it was, written in neat block letters under next of kin. Melissa Blake, ex-wife, divorced, unresponsive, emergency contact, none. Notes, owns a German shepherd named Shadow. Reeve frowned. The name stuck with him. Shadow. He flipped through more records. Nothing. But something about the name gnawed at him. Later that week, he made a quiet call to a local animal shelter, a few counties over, one where a former colleague now volunteered. He kept his voice low. "You ever get a dog named Shadow? German Shepherd. Maybe older now?" Owner might have been listed as deceased. There was a pause, then a quiet voice on the other end. "Yeah, 6 months ago. Brought in by a woman named Melissa Blake. Said the owner had passed. Dog's still here. Wasn't easy to place. He's loyal. Maybe too loyal." Reeve's jaw clenched. He didn't curse often, but the word burned in the back of his throat. Melissa Blake, the ex-wife who had walked away from Jack without a word, had lied. She hadn't just abandoned Jack. She had told his dog that he was dead. 2 days later, a white van pulled up behind the prison's receiving gate. Inside sat a volunteer named Clara Thompson, with soft hands and tired eyes, and beside her, staring out the window with quiet intensity, was Shadow. The dog had changed. Older now, muzzle graying, eyes heavier. But still proud, still alert, still waiting for something he couldn't name. Clara led him gently toward the building, her voice soft but firm. "We're going to see someone special today, okay? Just be brave." Shadow didn't bark. He didn't resist. He simply walked beside her, step by step, toward the only place that might still hold the scent of the man he once loved. Captain Reeve waited at cell 14, arms crossed. He wasn't sure this was the right thing to do. He wasn't sure what the rules said, but something deep in his gut told him that rules weren't built for situations like this. They were built for order. This was about something else. The cell door opened with a loud mechanical groan. Inside, Jack Callahan slowly sat up, his hand trembling slightly as he leaned against the wall. His face had grown thinner, hollower since the last time Reeve saw him, but his eyes lit up the moment he saw the leash, and then Shadow. The dog froze in the doorway. His nose twitched. He looked at the man in the cot, the face older, the frame frailer, the scent mixed with hospital air and rusted steel. And he didn't move. Jack's lips parted. "Shadow." But the dog didn't respond. He tilted his head slightly, ears raised not in recognition, but in confusion. Jack swallowed hard. "It's me, buddy." He extended a hand. But Shadow backed away. His fur bristled. He let out a low growl, unsure, eyes darting to Clara, seeking something familiar. Jack's hand trembled mid-air. His voice cracked. "You don't remember me?" For the first time in years, Jack Callahan looked truly broken. And even Captain Reeve, a man forged in iron routines and unbending law, felt something twist in his chest. Because dogs don't forget. So what happened? That was the moment everyone in that room realized. This story wasn't going to unfold the way they expected. Not yet. Because something deep, something painful, still stood between man and dog. Time, distance, lies. But the door was open, and the silence was not the end. It was only the beginning of something neither of them understood yet. The silence inside cell 14 was suffocating. Not the kind of silence Jack Callahan had grown used to in prison, the late-night quiet of steel and stone, the kind where loneliness echoed in the pipes. This was different. This silence was personal. Shadow, the dog Jack had raised from a broken, frightened pup, into a loyal companion, was standing no more than 6 feet away from him and growling. It wasn't a feral, vicious growl, but it was uncertain, protective. The kind of sound a dog makes when he isn't sure whether the person in front of him is a friend or a threat. Jack's hand froze mid-air. He had reached out instinctively, not as a prisoner, not as a dying man, but as someone reaching for a piece of his own heart. But the moment he moved, Shadow flinched. The dog backed up a step, then another. His ears flattened. He glanced at the volunteer, Clara Thompson, as if asking for confirmation. "Is this man safe?" Jack's throat tightened. "It's me," he whispered. "Shadow, it's me, boy." No reaction. Clara crouched beside the dog, her voice gentle. "It's okay." "You're okay. No one's gonna hurt you." Shadow leaned into her, pressing his head lightly against her arm, still avoiding Jack's eyes. And that was what broke something inside the man sitting on the bed. Because dogs don't do that. Dogs don't forget. Not real dogs. Not ones like Shadow. For 4 years, Jack had clung to the thought of this reunion. He had imagined it in the darkest hours of his sentence, Shadow barreling toward him, tongue out, tail wagging, that unmistakable whine that only came when he was happy. But that moment wasn't coming. Not today, not like this. From the hallway, Captain Daniel Reeves stood watching. His arms were crossed, jaw clenched. He had no words for what he was witnessing, but something didn't feel right. Not about the dog, about the story. He stepped forward, his voice calm, low. "When was the last time you saw the dog, Jack?" Jack blinked, still frozen. 4 years ago, he said hoarsely. "A few months after my sentencing." Reeve nodded. "You get updates since then?" Jack looked down. "My wife, Melissa, she wrote me once, said he was still healthy, that he waited by the door." Clara, still kneeling beside Shadow, slowly looked up. Her face had gone pale. "Wait, Melissa Blake?" she asked. Jack nodded. "That's her," Clara swallowed. We got Shadow from a shelter, about 6 months ago. He was dropped off by a woman named Melissa Blake. She said his owner had passed away." Jack didn't move. His eyes stared blankly ahead, but his fists clenched at his sides. "She told him I was dead." The words weren't shouted. They weren't angry, they were numb. Defeated. The final piece of betrayal he hadn't known he was waiting for. Captain Reeve let out a slow breath. Something in him tightened, not out of pity, but frustration. He had seen cruelty before. Manipulation. Lies. But this? Telling a dog, the most loyal creature on earth, that his person was gone. That wasn't just cruel. That was unnatural. Shadow remained by Clara's side. He wasn't growling anymore, but he was still unsure, still watching. And Jack. Jack slowly lowered his hand. "He doesn't know me anymore." Clara looked up. "No, it's not that. Dogs don't forget. But trauma can confuse them. Time, distance, scent. If she told him you were gone, he had to adapt. He had to bury that part of himself to survive." Jack blinked. Those words, "bury that part of himself," they landed deeper than they should have. Because that's what Jack had done too. In this prison, he had buried who he was, his past, his future. Even his name. All that remained was a shell that moved from meal to meal, from cell to infirmary, counting down days that no longer mattered. And now, he understood. Shadow wasn't rejecting him. Shadow was protecting himself, just like Jack had. The room remained still for another long minute. Then, slowly, Jack did something unexpected. He smiled. A sad smile. Crooked, tired, but real. "It's okay," he said softly. "I probably wouldn't recognize me either." Clara reached up and gently scratched behind Shadow's ears. The dog whined, low, confused. Then, He took one tentative step forward, just one. Jack didn't move, didn't speak. He simply lowered his eyes and breathed. Shadow sniffed the air. Another step closer now, his ears perked up. His tail, stiff and uncertain, gave the slightest twitch. Then he stopped, sniffed again. And Jack, without looking up, said one word: butterflies. It was the word he used to say every spring when they walked through the tall grass behind the house, and Shadow would chase the fluttering wings until his tongue lolled out in joy. Shadow's head jerked, eyes wide. His body stiffened. Then, a low whimper. His nose twitched. And Jack finally looked up, not with hope, not with expectation, but with something softer. Patience. Forgiveness. And maybe, just maybe, recognition. The air inside Cell 14 had shifted. It was no longer heavy with tension or confusion. Something else was taking its place, something delicate, fragile, like a thread stretching across time. Shadow, the German shepherd, who once couldn't be separated from his owner, now stood just a few feet away from him, older, grayer, and deeply conflicted. He had stopped growling. His ears were alert. His nose twitched rapidly. His eyes darted from Jack Callahan's face to his outstretched hands, and then back again. Something inside him was moving. Something was waking up. Captain Daniel Reeve watched silently from the doorway. He'd seen a lot of reunions in his 2 decades at Black Eagle, families sobbing behind glass walls, mothers shaking as they hugged sons in visitation rooms. But never like this, never between a man and a dog, and never with so much at stake. Because this wasn't just a goodbye. This wasn't just an old pet coming to visit his dying owner. This was 2 souls broken by time, betrayal, and silence searching for each other across the rubble. And the bridge between them was memory. Jack remained still. He didn't move toward the dog. Didn't repeat his name. Instead, he sat on the edge of the cot, palms facing upward in his lap, like a man offering a prayer. Shadow took another step forward. His head dipped. He sniffed the air again, closer this time, and moved toward Jack's right hand. The calluses were still there, though softer now. The skin was thinner, pale, but beneath the faint scent of antiseptic and prison soap, there was something else. Wood shavings. Jack used to smell like cedar and pine from years of carpentry, of sanding, sawing, building things with love. Shadow's nose pressed against his fingers. He paused. Then sniffed again, deeper. Jack didn't look up. He didn't dare breathe. Then Shadow moved, not abruptly, not with a bark or a whimper. He simply leaned in and sniffed Jack's face, the stubble, the hollow cheeks, the aging lines that hadn't been there before. But beneath all that, beneath the time and pain and loss, Shadow found it. The scent he never truly forgot. The man who held him during thunderstorms. The man who whispered, "Good boy," every morning before coffee. The man who once cried into his fur the night his father died. That man was still here, different. But here, Shadow froze. His body trembled. His eyes, dark and glassy, widened as if something deep inside him had finally clicked into place. Then, a sound, not a growl, not a bark, but a soft, desperate whine, the kind a dog makes when his heart breaks open. And then he moved, quickly, clumsily. Shadow lunged forward, pressing his head into Jack's chest, nearly knocking the frail man backward onto the cot. Jack gasped, not from fear, not from pain, but from relief. He brought his arms up and wrapped them around the dog's neck, pulling him close, burying his face in the fur he thought he'd never touch again. "You remember?" Jack whispered, his voice cracking. "You remember me?" Tears slid down his cheeks. and Shadow tail wagging furiously now, whimpering, licking his face like a pup, reunited with the only family he ever knew, made a sound so human that even Clara, the volunteer, had to cover her mouth to stifle a sob. Captain Reeve looked away, not because he was ashamed, but because something inside his chest had started to ache, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The moment lasted longer than anyone expected. Jack clung to Shadow like a man holding on to the last piece of the world that still made sense. And Shadow, despite the years, the confusion, the pain of being told his owner had died, leaned into Jack as if to say, "Forgive me. I didn't understand at first. You've changed so much, but it's still you." And Jack understood. Because he had changed, too. Prison had aged him faster than time. Grief had thinned his bones and hollowed out his smile. But none of that mattered now, because the one soul who truly knew him, who saw him not as a number, not as a criminal, not as a dying man, had finally come back. Later, as the cell door closed quietly behind the guards and Clara led Shadow back toward the outer yard, Jack sat in silence. His eyes were still wet, his lips curled into the faintest smile. He was tired. More than ever. But he wasn't alone anymore. Not really. Shadow remembered. That was enough. That was everything. 2 nights after the reunion, the halls of Black Eagle Penitentiary were quiet, quieter than usual. Rain tapped gently against the windows of the infirmary. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere far off, a door creaked on rusted hinges, but in room 3, behind a pale blue curtain, Jack Callahan lay still. His breathing was shallow now. His skin had grown translucent, stretched thin over bone and memory. His eyes remained open, though unfocused, like they were watching something no one else could see. Maybe it was the past. Or maybe it was Shadow, the dog he had loved like a child, who had only just remembered him after years apart. They had given Jack 2 days. 2 days after the reunion. 2 days filled with more peace than the past 4 years combined. And now, time was slipping through his fingers like sand. But there was still something he needed to do. Captain Daniel Reeve stood just inside the room, arms crossed, expression unreadable. In one hand, he held a clipboard. In the other, a pen. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Jack turned his head slightly. His voice was barely a whisper. "Yeah, I want it in writing." Reeve handed him the pen. Jack's fingers trembled as he took it. It took effort just to hold it steady. But with a slow, determined stroke, he signed the bottom of the page. Transfer of guardianship. Canine Unit Number 473, Shadow. With that signature, Shadow would no longer be a forgotten shelter dog, or the misunderstood pet of a dead man. He would become something more. Clara Thompson stood nearby, her hand resting gently on Shadow's head. The dog sat beside the bed, eyes trained on Jack like he knew. Knew this was goodbye. Knew this was the last night his person would speak his name. Shadow didn't whine. He didn't bark. He simply sat there proud, noble, patient. Jack reached out and let his fingers rest on the dog's fur. "You're gonna help people now, buddy," he murmured. "The way you helped me." Captain Reeve cleared his throat, trying to mask the emotion tightening in his chest. "We've got a pilot program," he explained. "Therapy animals for inmates with PTSD, trauma cases, isolation units. We've never had a dog like him before." Jack gave a faint smile. "He's special." "Yeah," Reeve said quietly. "So are you." Jack didn't respond. He closed his eyes, exhaled deeply, and whispered something no one in the room could quite hear. It could have been a prayer, or a memory, or maybe just the name. Shadow. And then, just like that, he was gone. Jack Callahan died at 6:14 a.m. He had no funeral. No flowers, no obituary, but news of his death spread quietly among the guards, especially those who had known him. A few nodded in silence, some whispered stories over morning coffee. The man who never raised his voice. The man who saved a rookie officer during a riot. The man whose dog came back for him even after 4 years. Shadow remained silent for hours after Jack passed. He lay curled at the foot of the bed, refusing to move even as the sheet was pulled over his best friend's face. When Clara finally coaxed him out of the room, the dog turned one last time, looked toward the cot, and whimpered softly, as if to say, "I didn't want to leave you again." That week, Shadow was officially enrolled in Project Haven, Black Eagle's new canine therapy initiative, a program that gave rescued dogs a new purpose inside prison walls. Some were used in group therapy. Others simply sat beside inmates during difficult sessions, offering silent companionship. But Shadow did more than that. He listened, he comforted, he healed. Inmates who hadn't spoken in weeks found themselves talking aloud when Shadow was in the room. Men with nightmares slept through the night for the first time in years, because Shadow curled up near their bunks and wouldn't move until morning. And the strange thing was, he always chose cell block C. That was where Jack had spent most of his sentence. That was where cell 14 stood now empty, its bed stripped, its walls quiet. And every time Shadow walked past that door, he paused, just for a second. His ears would perk up, his tail would stiffen, and then, barely audible, he would whimper. The same sound he made when Jack first returned to him in that sterile room. The same sound of memory, of longing, of love. Captain Reeve watched from the upper tier one afternoon, hands resting on the railing. He saw the way Shadow interacted with the inmates, how they softened around him, how they smiled, how they reached out like they were remembering who they were before the world turned cold. He thought about Jack. A man thrown away by the justice system, a man who lost everything except his dog. And in that moment, Reeve didn't see a prisoner and a pet. He saw something much bigger. He saw a legacy, because sometimes a man dies and leaves behind nothing but regret. But sometimes a man dies and leaves behind a living reminder that love still matters, even here, even behind bars. Even in a place like Black Eagle. It had been 3 weeks since Jack Callahan passed away. Black Eagle Penitentiary had returned to its routines. Gates clanked open, boots echoed down concrete hallways. The smell of overcooked oatmeal drifted through the mess hall each morning. But something was different. It was subtle, a shift in tone, a presence that softened the edges of this harsh place. It was Shadow. The German shepherd who once belonged to an inmate. Now, he belonged to everyone. Every morning, Clara Thompson brought Shadow through the inner yard gates, his harness fitted with a blue patch that read, Therapy Animal Project Haven. At first, the inmates didn't know what to make of him. Some watched from their bunks, silent. Others kept their distance, arms crossed, wary of what a dog could possibly do in a place like this. But Shadow didn't care. He didn't demand trust. He simply showed up. He sat beside inmates during counseling sessions, resting his head quietly on trembling knees. He walked the isolation wing, where men who hadn't spoken in weeks reached out to touch his fur, their voices cracking open after years of silence. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't beg. He just listened, and somehow that was enough. But there was one place Shadow always returned to. Every day, without fail. Cell 14. The door was empty now. The lights off. The bed stripped bare. Yet whenever Clara led Shadow past that cell, he would pause. Just for a second. Sometimes he'd sit. Other times he'd tilt his head or sniff the air. But always he would whimper. Low, soft, like a memory surfacing. Like he was saying, I remember who lived here. I remember who I loved. No one told him to do it. No one trained him to stop. He just did. Because dogs don't forget. Not the ones who were truly loved. Captain Daniel Reeves started timing it. Every time Shadow passed cell 14, he paused for exactly 7 seconds, not 6. Not 8, 7, like a ritual. Like a prayer. Reeve mentioned it to Clara one afternoon as they watched from the mezzanine. "He doesn't do that with any other cell," he said quietly. Clara nodded, eyes damp. "He still thinks Jack is in there, or maybe he just wants to say good morning." Reeve didn't respond. But that night, long after lights out, he walked the block alone. He stopped in front of cell 14 and leaned on the frame. The air inside was still. Cold, but not empty. And on the wall, just beside the metal bed frame, someone had scratched a line into the concrete. A name. Shadow always. Word about the dog spread beyond Black Eagle, therapists. Guards, even wardens at other facilities came to observe. They saw how inmates opened up when Shadow was present. How men who hadn't hugged another living being in 20 years now cradled his head like a child. And yet, the story that stuck, the one they all whispered about in staff meetings and over coffee, wasn't about the program. It was about the bond. About a dying man whose final wish wasn't freedom, but forgiveness. About a dog who forgot for a moment and then remembered forever. In the end, Jack Callahan didn't leave behind money or property or even a gravestone. He left behind something rarer, a living memory, one that walked on 4 legs. One that sat patiently in the darkness and whispered, in his own quiet way, "I remember who you were, and I'm still here." His name was Miguel Torres. He'd been at Black Eagle for 6 years. Armed robbery, 2 counts. But what most people didn't know or didn't care to ask was that before prison, Miguel had never held a gun in his life. He had worked at a diner, sent money home to his mother, and played guitar in a church band on Sundays. Until one bad night, one bad friend, one desperate decision. Now he spent his days in silence, staring at a wall in cell block C. He didn't speak. Didn't write, didn't answer when called. Some inmates said he was crazy. Others said he just gave up. No one knew for sure, until Shadow sat down outside his cell. It was a regular Tuesday morning. Clara Thompson walked Shadow down the row, nodding to guards and stopping occasionally as inmates reached out to pet him. But when they passed cell 19, Shadow froze. He didn't bark, didn't growl, he just sat. Still, alert, and stared at the man on the bottom bunk, a figure hunched in the corner, knees tucked in, eyes blank. Clara tugged gently on the leash. "Come on, boy." Shadow didn't move. Then he let out a low sound, not a whine, not a warning, but something in between. A sound that said, "This one, stay." Clara looked at the cell tag. Torres. "Been quiet since March." The guard shrugged. "He doesn't talk to anyone. Don't waste your time." But Shadow didn't believe in time. He believed in presence, so he stayed. He lay down just outside the cell door and stared in. Didn't blink, didn't fidget, just waited. Hours passed. Shadow came back again the next day. And the day after that. Always stopping at cell 19, always laying down, always watching. No one said anything. Until the 4th day when Miguel, for the first time in months, moved. He didn't speak. He didn't look at the guards, but he reached out slowly, carefully, and slid his fingers through the bars. Shadow stood up and stepped forward, pressing his head gently against Miguel's hand. A breath caught in Clara's throat. So small. So simple. But in prison, even the smallest act of connection could be revolutionary. The next day, Miguel spoke. One word. Dog. The day after that, 2 more. Why here? Clara sat beside the cell, trying not to cry. She knew why. Because Shadow had belonged to someone who also sat in a cell, someone who also lost everything, someone who also went silent until love reached through the dark. And now Shadow, without command, without instruction, was doing the same for someone new. Over the following weeks, Miguel began to change. He still didn't speak much, but he asked to go to group therapy. He took up a job in the laundry room. He began writing letters, even if he never sent them. He still had nightmares, but they didn't paralyze him anymore. Because when they did come, Shadow was there, laying by the bars, breathing slow, steady, safe. One afternoon, Captain Daniel Reeve pulled Clara aside. "You see this?" He held up Miguel's file. On the back, scribbled in pencil, was a single line of writing. "The dog remembered me before I remembered myself." Clara smiled. "That's what he does." Reeve didn't say anything. But when Shadow walked past cell 14 that night and paused for his usual 7 seconds, Reeve saluted. Not because he had to, but because something holy was happening in that prison. Not with sermons or speeches, but with silence, with second chances. And with a dog who refused to forget the men the world had thrown away. At Black Eagle Penitentiary, inmates don't talk much about legacies. This isn't the kind of place where people leave behind anything that lasts. Most leave behind broken promises, letters returned unopened, names carved into walls forgotten. But every now and then, something different happens, something no one expects. That's what happened with Jack Callahan. The man who died quietly in cell 14, with no visitors, no last rites, and no funeral. But somehow after he was gone, his name began to live. Not loudly. Not in speeches or ceremonies, but in moments, in choices. In the steady rhythm of 4 paws walking the cell blocks, in the gentle paws of a dog named Shadow who never once passed cell 14 without stopping to remember. The story began to spread. First, among the inmates. They called it the cell 14 pause, a quiet 7 seconds where Shadow would stop, lower his head, and let out a soft whimper. No one taught him to do it. But when he did, the men around him would stop too. They didn't say anything. They didn't cry. They just paused. And for a place built on concrete, rules, and regrets, 7 seconds of silence became something sacred. Then the guards noticed. Some of them laughed at first. But when they saw hardened men, gang leaders, lifers, former enforcers close their eyes during that brief moment of Shadow's pause, something changed. They stopped laughing. They started listening. One by one, inmates began asking about Jack. What was he like? What did he do for that dog to love him like that? Why does Shadow always stop at his cell? Clara Thompson, the volunteer who walked Shadow every day, began telling his story. She didn't glorify him. She didn't make him into a hero. She simply told the truth. A man who made a mistake, who was broken, who lost everything, but who never stopped loving one dog. And in the end, was remembered by that dog more than any human ever had. Soon, the story reached beyond Black Eagle. Other prisons called. Writers asked for interviews. One warden from Illinois wrote a letter to Captain Daniel Reeve saying, "We don't know what you're doing with that dog, but our inmates talk about him like he's Moses." Reeve posted the letter in the staff break room, and under it, he pinned a photocopy of Jack's intake form. The name, Callahan, Jack Edward. Sentence, 12 years. Crime, second-degree manslaughter. Notes, no visitors, no parole. Below it, in Reeve's handwriting, remembered. Every day, by someone who couldn't speak. That spring, Black Eagle launched a new program. They named it the Callahan Initiative. It paired rescue dogs with long-term inmates, not for obedience training, but for healing, for connection, for the silent restoration of the parts of themselves that the world had erased. And Shadow, He became the face of it. His photo sitting quietly in front of cell 14 was printed on every flyer, every newsletter, every training manual. A dog who once forgot, then remembered, then chose to remember others. By now, Jack's name had reached places he never imagined. A former inmate wrote a poem titled "The Man with the Dog Who Waited." A high school counselor in Ohio read it aloud in a class on forgiveness. A woman in Wisconsin mailed in a donation with a note that read, "I was Melissa once. I left someone behind. I'm trying to come back." No one knew who she was, but Clara kept the note in her journal anyway. Because it meant something. Because Jack Callahan, a man the system forgot, had sparked something far beyond those prison walls, and still, every day, without fail, Shadow would pause in front of cell 14, 7 seconds. A breath, a memory, a quiet message the world had almost missed. Love outlives punishment. Loyalty outlives time, and even in the darkest places, someone remembers you. It was Visitor Day at Black Eagle Penitentiary. A rare event. The warden had allowed a group of community leaders, journalists, and rehabilitation partners to tour the facility, part of a new transparency initiative under the Callahan Initiative. There were no fancy speeches, no cameras flashing, just a few handshakes, clipboards, and the sound of keys jingling as doors opened and shut behind them. But in cell block C, something caught their attention. A group of inmates, some with tattoos, others in wheelchairs, one holding a weathered copy of Mice and Men, were all gathered around a single dog. Shadow, still proud, still silent. Still stopping every morning in front of cell 14 even though no one lived there anymore. A young man in the group, probably new to the program, maybe only 21, leaned over and whispered, "What's with that cell? Why does the dog always stop there?" The question wasn't mocking. It was genuine, curious, and for a moment no one answered. Then Miguel Torres, the man who once hadn't spoken in months, cleared his throat and said quietly, "That's Jack's cell." The visitor blinked. "Jack who?" A pause. Then one of the older inmates, a man with a weathered face and a Bible tucked under his arm, said simply, "Jack Callahan." The room went still. Even the guards didn't interrupt. Shadow, sensing the energy, sat beside the cell door, facing inward like he always did. And Miguel, who had never liked the sound of his own voice, spoke again, this time not to the visitor, but to the group, like he was remembering it for himself. He didn't have family. No one visited. He died alone in here, except for that dog. He gestured to Shadow. But this dog, he waited 4 years, and when they brought him back, Jack was still Jack. That dog knew. The room stayed silent, the weight of those words settling like dust in sunlight. The warden arrived a few minutes later. The tour continued. Papers were handed out, therapists spoke, officials nodded politely. But later that afternoon, before leaving, the youngest visitor, the same man who had asked the question, returned to cell 14 alone. Shadow was sitting there as usual, unmoving. The man crouched beside him. Didn't touch him, didn't try to pet him, just whispered, "He must have been a good man." And in that moment, Shadow turned, looked at the young man, and softly licked the back of his hand. No bark, no tail wag, just recognition. Just truth, the kind no words are needed to explain. That night, as the lights dimmed in Black Eagle, Captain Daniel Reeve walked the block alone. He stopped at cell 14. He ran his fingers along the scratch in the wall, the one that read, "Shadow always." Then he did something no one expected. He unlocked the cell, stepped inside, and placed a small, bronze plaque above the bedframe. Simple, clean, unadorned. It read, "Jack Callahan, he died with nothing, but he left behind everything that matters." No spotlight, no ceremony, just memory. and a dog who in the quietest part of the night still lay curled just outside the door, keeping watch, because some names deserve to be remembered, even if the world tries to forget. The story of Jack Callahan and his dog Shadow is more than just a quiet tale of loyalty. It's a powerful reminder that love, forgiveness, and simple human dignity can outlast even the harshest of circumstances. In a world that often forgets those who fall, it was a dog, not a court, not a family member, who remembered the man Jack used to be. Shadow didn't see a prisoner. He saw his person. And that kind of loyalty teaches us something. Even when the world lets go of us, the goodness we've given has a way of finding its way back. For older American audiences, this story resonates deeply. It speaks to the quiet truth we all face. In the end, we may not leave behind riches or headlines, but we can leave behind something far greater: love that lingers, kindness that heals, and memories that refuse to fade. Sometimes, the legacy that matters most isn't carved in stone. It walks on 4 legs and pauses for 7 seconds in front of a silent cell just to say, "I still remember." Still,